Hi, everybody. We're back, and today we're talking about political participation. Most specifically, why do people vote? And the flip side, why do some people not vote? So, I am a big fan of definitions. I really like to be precise in my language. So I wanted to start with a definition of participation, specifically political participation. These two political scientists, Sidney Verba and John Nye, in 1972, they defined political participation as acts that aim at influencing the government either by affecting the choice of government personnel or by affecting the choices made by government personnel. So you can imagine that there are a wide range of acts of political participation. Voting is obviously one of them, but so is writing a letter to your member of Congress. That is an act that aims to influence the government by affecting the choices made by government personnel. Or participating in a public protest, like the May Day protests or Black Lives Matters protests. Those are acts that are aimed at influencing the government, specifically by affecting the choices made by government personnel. Political participation does not have to be necessarily a sort of by the books, goody two shoes sort of behavior. There are some acts of political participation that are actually what we would call transgressive, that are sort of out there. There was an organization in the 1970s and 1980s that was quite active called ACT UP. ACT UP was aimed at increasing rights for the LGBTQ community. Specifically, they were addressing the issue of HIV and AIDS research. And ACT UP did a number of what we would call guerrilla political movements. They did all sorts of really interesting, kind of out there, almost like performance art sorts of activities that were acts of political participation. They were trying to change people's minds, make people aware, and change government policy. Not every act that does change government policy is an act of political participation. The example that I like to use here is the murder of Megan Kanka, who was a young girl who was murdered in, I believe, the very early 1990s. And her death led to the enactment of Megan's Law, which requires, it's a federal law, and it requires states to provide information about sex offenders to members of the community. So Megan's Law is an incredibly important piece of public policy. Certainly, Megan Kanka's parents and the people that supported them were engaged in acts of political participation when they got this legislation passed. The man who took Megan Kanka's life, his behavior influenced government, influenced the choices made by government personnel. His behavior, his criminal act, did in fact change public policy, but he was not motivated by a desire to change public policy. So even though his act indirectly changed policy, it was not an act of political participation. It's important to remember that political participation is an intentional act. It is something you are trying to do. You may not be successful, but you are trying to influence government, either by affecting who gets elected or by affecting the choices that they make once they are elected. The reason that we're focusing specifically on voting is not that other acts of political participation are unimportant. Quite the contrary. I think a lot of other forms of political participation, like protest movements, sit-ins, litigation, lots and lots of things, are actually extraordinarily important, and at moments in time have had massive effects on political behavior. But we refer to voting as a threshold act of political participation. Most people who participate in politics vote. So you have a lot of people who do not participate at all. And then you have a lot of people who vote, and that is all that they do. And then you have people who vote, but also engage in other forms of political participation, like donating money to campaigns, or putting yard signs in their yard, or participating in protest movements. There are also some people who engage in those non-voting acts of political participation, things like donating money, marching, etc. There are some people who do those things who do not vote, but that's a very small number of people. So most people who are going to participate in some way politically, their sort of gateway, their threshold is to vote. So that's one of the reasons why we are particularly interested in voting. That, and the fact that it is the most direct way for members of the population to affect the choice of government personnel, because you are directly saying, I want this person to be my president, or I want this person to be my senator. Okay. So why do people vote? Before the 1990s, so going back, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, during those earlier years, there were largely two groups of political scientists who tackled this issue of why people vote. They came at it from very different perspectives, using very different methods. One group of scholars are what we refer to as rational choice theorists. And I'll explain what rational choice theory is in a minute. But at the moment, just suffice it to know that it is a very theoretical approach to human behavior, and it's derived from the world of economics. So if I have any econ majors out there, you've probably heard of rational choice theory. The other group of scholars who were tackling this issue of voting, this puzzle of voting, are sometimes referred to as the demographic predictor researchers. Sometimes they're also referred to as the Michigan School, because a lot of them came out of the University of Michigan, or they used the data produced by the Survey Research Center at University of Michigan. These people are looking at what aspects of a person's identity or experience make it more likely that they are going to vote. Okay, so let's look at these in a little more detail. So rational choice theory, again, I promised I would say a bit about what this is, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on rat choice theory, but the basic idea is that people have preferences. They have a preferred state of the world. They have a second choice, a third choice, a fourth choice, a fifth choice. If you went to the grocery store and you were looking in the frozen food aisle at all of the choices of frozen potatoes, I'm hungry, I haven't had lunch yet, so I'm thinking frozen potatoes. You're looking at all the frozen potatoes, you would definitely have a first choice. Maybe it's the Ore-Ida tater tots. And then your second choice is the Ore-Ida crispy crowns. And then your third choice is the Ore-Ida hash browns. And then maybe your next choice would be the store-brand tater tots. And then Ore-Ida Potatoes O'Brien, right? You could look at all of those different products and you could rank order them. What is your favorite? What is your least favorite? Which ones would you prefer? The second part of rational choice theory, or another part of rational choice theory, is that people are going to act to maximize your preferences. So if you prefer tater tots to Crispy Crowns and they have both tater tots and Crispy Crowns and they're the same price, you're going to buy the tater tots because that's your preference. Why would you buy something you don't like compared to something you do like, or even something that you like less rather than something that you do like? So everything else being equal, if you prefer tater tots to Crispy Crowns, you're going to buy the tater tots. However, your choice of frozen potato is constrained. First of all, it's constrained by your resources. If you don't have a lot of money, you may skip the Ore-Ida products entirely and go straight to the store brand because they are less expensive. You are also constrained by your information. If you have never tried Crispy Crowns, you may not realize that they are superior to tater tots. You may not know that. So you are making a choice, but you don't have the information to make the choice about what would truly make you happiest. You're also constrained by what other people do. If you, for example, live in a household with another human being, that person may have a preference for Crispy Crowns over tater tots, and you want to make that person happy. Or you get to the grocery store, and because everyone else really likes tater tots, they're all gone, right? So you have a choice that has been removed because of what other people have done. Okay, what does this have to do with voting? So in 1957, a young economist wrote a very short but very insightful book called An Economic Theory of Democracy. And I'm going to warn you, there's an equation, right? This looks like math, but it's actually common sense, and we'll see that in a second. So what Anthony Downs said is that people vote if P times B minus C is greater than 0. This is effectively what we call a cost-benefit analysis. If your benefits outweigh your costs, you're going to do a thing, right? So the B in this equation refers to benefit, and specifically, it's the benefit you get by having your most preferred candidate win the election. So imagine that it's last year, and you're looking at the presidential election ballot, and you very much prefer Donald Trump to Biden. So you are going to get a benefit if Trump wins. You're going to be happier if Trump wins than if Biden wins. Maybe you're not going to get a benefit because maybe you like both of them equally well, or you dislike both of them equally. Doesn't really matter whether you like them or not. If you are indifferent between them, then it does not matter to you which one of them wins, and there's no benefit to you that can possibly flow from the outcome of this election. You discount any benefit that you have by the probability of getting the benefit. But here's the thing, it's the probability of getting the benefit because of your action. So for example, let's say that you really want pizza for dinner. You could make pizza, you could order pizza, you could do these things. But if you are living in the dorm and for some reason the residence hall orders pizza every Monday night, you can have pizza for dinner without doing anything. And you're going to do that, right? You're going to do the free thing. You're going to get the free pizza that you didn't have to work for, that you didn't have to do anything for. So what we're really interested in here is, what is the benefit that I can get from acting, from doing this thing? If Joe Biden is going to win this election, no matter what happens, whether I vote or not, then there's no benefit to me of voting either for Biden or for Trump, because the outcome is going to be the same, or for staying home. Still, the outcome is going to be the same. Joe Biden's going to win. Doesn't matter what I do. So why would I stir myself, get off of my couch, go all the way down to the Civic Center, stand in line, cast a vote, maybe come out and it's raining? Why would I do any of that if the outcome is going to be the same? So this probability is the probability that your action is going to give you this benefit, right? The C is the cost, because the action has a cost. We don't have to pay directly to vote anymore. We've long since done away with poll taxes, but there is still a cost to voting. You have to maybe take time off of work, so you lose income, or you take time off from watching TV, so you lose enjoyment, you lose leisure time. You have to expend a little gas money to get to the Civic Center. Maybe you have to get childcare. You have to endure the presence of other people, which for some of us is itself a cost. I don't like to be around other people. So there are costs associated with voting beyond handing over cash. Okay. So what this means, taken together, is that if the benefit of voting is greater than the cost of voting, you're going to vote. And the benefit of voting is, what do you get by having your preferred candidate win, and discounted by the probability that your action is going to lead to that benefit. It's helpful to think about lottery tickets, right? If all we cared about when playing the lottery is the benefit, we would all play the lottery every single week, because the potential benefit is like $10 million. I want $10 million. That sounds fantastic. Sign me up. But we discount that $10 million by the probability that purchasing a ticket is actually going to get you $10 million. The probability that you're going to win based on purchasing the ticket. And then there is a cost. It doesn't cost much, but once you've discounted that $10 million down based on the very low probability of winning, in reality, the $2 it takes to purchase a ticket is more than the benefit, right? So a lot of people choose not to play the lottery. And it's not that they're stupid and giving up free money because $10 million. No, there's a cost to playing the lottery, and it's small, but you have to discount your benefit with this probability term, right? Okay. So this actually makes a lot of intuitive sense, but it's not great at predicting actual human behavior. It makes sense that people would do this kind of cost-benefit analysis in deciding whether to vote. But if this is an accurate reflection of what goes on in people's brains, we would anticipate that people would never vote, because the likelihood that your vote is going to be the one that tips the election is so small that it renders the benefit of winning the election, it renders that benefit very, very, very tiny. And even the pretty modest cost of voting is going to outweigh that benefit. So rational people, especially in a large community, in a large democracy, should really never vote. Yet they do. So one way that rational choice theorists have tried to fix the model to explain why so many people vote when it is not rational to do so is to redefine the type of benefits that you get from voting. Specifically, the B, that benefit, is the benefit that you get from having your preferred candidate win, the benefit that you get from having President Joe Biden instead of President Donald Trump. But there's an additional benefit to voting. We sometimes refer to it as civic duty or psychic benefits or psychological benefits. But basically, it's that feeling of pride that you voted. Like you are part of something bigger than yourself. You get the little sticker. Everyone knows that you voted. They look at you like you're a good citizen. You feel like a good citizen. You feel like you did your part, that you are part of history. That civic duty may determine whether or not people vote, because it isn't dependent on winning and losing. You get it no matter what. You get it simply by casting a ballot. No matter what happens in the election, you're going to receive that benefit. So if that benefit for you is high, if you have a strong engagement with your community, a strong sense of civic responsibility, a strong pride in the democratic process, then you may vote even though you realize that the action is unlikely to change anything. Another reason that we question the rational choice model just a little bit is that if it's correct, then when we change that cost term, we should see a change in voting behavior. If we make the costs higher, like people have to drive farther to get to the polls, then we should see turnout go down. By the same token, if we make it easier to vote, we reduce the costs of voting, we should see more people vote. In 1993, Congress passed the National Voter Registration Act, which is better known as the Motor Voter Act. And what it does is it requires states to give you the opportunity to register to vote when you get your driver's license. So there is no more cost to registering because you're going to get your driver's license no matter what. You don't have to make a separate trip. You don't have to fill out a separate form. You don't have to do anything. It just happens unless you move. Neither here nor there. But we would expect that by reducing the costs of voting, by reducing the costs to register to vote, we would expect turnout to increase. It didn't. More people were registered, so it worked in the sense that more people were registered to vote, but they did not then follow up by actually voting, which it is just puzzling. It's puzzling. If people are making this cost-benefit analysis and you reduce the costs, you should see more people vote. We reduced the costs, more people didn't vote. Where's the disconnect? Okay. Meanwhile, at the same time, you have this other group of political scientists who are focusing on the characteristics of people who vote. What is it that differentiates the people who vote from the people who don't vote? One of the things that they look at is age. So on this slide, you see a graph of the of turnout, right? What percentage of the population of a particular age shows up to vote? And the results are striking. This is from both the 2000 and 2004 elections. The patterns are basically the same both years. What we see is that the number of people, or the percentage of people who are 70 years old who vote, is more than twice the percentage of people who are about 30 years old who vote. In other words, the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. And we see this over and over and over again, whether we look at elections in 2000 or elections in 1960, whether we look at presidential elections, congressional elections, school board elections, doesn't really matter. No matter what type of election we're looking at or when, we see that the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. Well, that's kind of interesting. But these people, these scholars pre-1990s, didn't really take the next step to say, why? Why do older people vote more than younger people? What's going on here? Incidentally, if you notice that the percentage kind of tapers off, and then actually if this graph extended beyond 70, you'd see that the percentage of people who vote turnout actually drops after age 70. This is actually a very practical phenomenon. This is because people who are over the age of 70 have a harder time getting to the polls because they often cannot drive, they're sick, they're homebound, etc. So once you hit 70, the graph starts to change because people become less and less likely to be able to get to the polls to vote. Okay. Excuse me. So the upshot of all of this is that on the one hand, you have a group of scholars who are developing this really complex and yet intuitive explanation for why people should vote. But they're not doing a great job of describing actual behavior. The other camp is developing descriptions of who actually votes and can create models that anticipate who will vote and who will not with remarkable accuracy, but they don't really explain why, right? Why are people voting? Why are more educated people more likely to vote? Why are older people more likely to vote? What's going on here? In the 1990s, there was a group of scholars, Henry Brady, Sidney Verba, and K. Lehman Schlossman. Brady, Verba, and Schlossman wrote a book called Voice and Equality. It's a fantastic book. It's over 600 pages long, but it's a gripping read, I promise you. In Voice and Equality, Verba, Brady, and Schlossman promote something called the civic voluntarism model of voting. I do not actually understand why they picked that title. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but here is what the civic voluntarism model is. The model itself makes sense. I just don't understand the title. What they say is that the decision to vote, or the likelihood of voting, is a function of three things. It's a function of your interest in and engagement in politics. It's a function of mobilization and recruitment. And it is a function of your resources. If we want to try to map this model onto the rational choice model that Anthony Downs created for us, interest and engagement are going to affect the benefits of voting, both the benefit that you get from having your preferred candidate win and your sense of civic responsibility, your psychic benefit. And both mobilization and recruitment and resources are going to affect the costs of voting. So interest and engagement, what are we talking about here? We are talking about being interested in politics. We are talking about something called political efficacy, which is an internal belief that you can affect the political world, that you can make a difference. It is your sense of civic duty, right? Your sense that voting is important, that the democratic process is valuable. In some cases, interest and engagement may be motivated by group consciousness. So if you are a member, particularly of a minority group, whether that's a religious minority or a racial minority or member of the disabled community or the LGBTQ community or whatever, any group where where that's kind of makes up part of your identity, and you are aware of this commonality between you and other people who are like you, and have a sense that their fate and your fate are tied together, that can increase your interest in politics. Party identification. Some people, we're going to talk about partisanship down the road, but if you identify as being a member of a political party, that introduces this sort of football game mentality, this sort of my team is going to win mentality, and it activates an interest in the political process. If you don't identify with either political party, then the whole thing seems very removed, or can seem very removed from you. And then there's a commitment to personal issues. So if you recognize the relationship between the political world and your own fate, you're more likely to be interested in politics and engaged in the political world. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit and think about who would be kind of activated based on these phenomena. So your interest in politics is probably going to go up as your education goes up, because you're going to understand politics better. You're going to be able to consume media. You're going to be able to read the newspaper more quickly and with more joy. And so that's going to assist in your interest in politics. Your sense of political efficacy definitely goes up as your education goes up. You become more self-confident about your ability to interact with the world and change the world. Your sense of civic duty may increase as a result of your group membership. It may result from an increase in education, again, sort of learning about the democratic process and understanding how you are ultimately responsible for how our government runs. We mentioned group consciousness. Being a member of a minority group can certainly aid in a sense of group consciousness, but so too can, for example, being an active member of your church, even if your church is not like a minority religion. Being an active member of your church, seeing your fellow parishioners as part of your world and recognizing your common fate can increase your interest and engagement in politics. Party identification is something, as we will see, that is largely inherited. So if your family is interested and engaged in politics, you yourself are more likely to be interested and engaged in politics. And a commitment to personal issues, most people are interested or committed to their own personal issues. But again, seeing the connection between your personal issues, like how much money you're making and how much you're taxed, and whether you have access to health care and whether you can afford your child's college education, all of those things. Seeing the relationship between those things and politics may again be a function of education. Mobilization and recruitment. So this chunk of the puzzle relates to the likelihood that groups or politicians are going to reach out to you and try to help you participate. They're going to try to get you to the polls. They're going to provide you with information. They're going to maybe drive you to the polls. So being asked to participate is the key here. And what sorts of things can you imagine would increase the likelihood that you would be recruited, that people would ask you to participate? And the one that comes to mind immediately for me is money. If you are wealthy, people are going to reach out to you and try to get you to participate by giving money. If you don't have money, they may not ask you to participate. We now know that you can build a pretty successful campaign off of a bunch of very small donations, but this is a relatively recent phenomenon, and most politicians up until the early 2000s definitely saw wealthy donors as the only donors they should worry about. Now, politicians recognize that they don't want to leave money on the table. They don't want to pass up the $5 donations either. But nevertheless, the people who have a lot of money to give and who have friends who have a lot of money to give, those are people you want on your side. So you're more likely as a politician or a political party to reach out to people who have money. You're also more likely to be recruited if you are active in your church. If you're a member of a religious organization and you routinely go to church, churches are a place where sometimes politicians find voters. There's law about what politicians can actually say in churches before churches lose their tax exempt status. But there's nothing wrong with a church inviting a presidential candidate to come to services and say a few words about the importance of God in his life, right? And then that politician may stick around afterwards for coffee hour and hand out cards, right? So you're more likely to be recruited if you are a member of a church or if you're a member of a union. It's not a thing in Texas, but elsewhere, if you are a member of a union that actually has some power, you're more likely to be recruited. And again, education. If a lot of politicians come to college campuses and they reach out to college graduates, it's just much more likely that you are going to interact with a politician or interact with a political party if you go through the college education experience. Resources, this one's pretty obvious. Resources here include time. This is where being old helps, right? Because you have more time on your hands. But also being wealthy, not having an hourly job, or maybe only having one job as opposed to 2 or 3. You have more time on your hand. Having money helps you participate in the political process, both by giving money to candidates, but also ensuring that you can get transportation to the polls, that you can afford childcare when you go to vote, etc. Resources also include what we call civic skills. So these are skills like organization, communication, now those are kind of the two big ones, but like an ability to network, interpersonal skills, those sorts of skills are valuable if you want to participate in the political world, because you can, for example, engage other people in conversations about politics. You can spend time working for a campaign in a meaningful way because you have skills to give back to that community. So time is often a function of income and age. Money is often a function of obviously income, but also age. Civic skills, very much a function of education, and also perhaps group membership. Again, being active in your church, being active in your community, being active in group politics, identity politics, gives you an opportunity to build those civic skills in other contexts, and then you can bring them to the political world. There we go. Language skills, social adeptness. That's the one I don't have. So all of these resources are allocated across the population in uneven ways. There are definitely certain groups and certain people who have more resources than others. There are certain groups and certain people who are more likely to be mobilized or recruited than others. And there are certain groups and certain people who are more likely to be interested and engaged in the political world than others. So the civic voluntarism model, like I said, kind of connects these demographic factors and our understanding of the costs and benefits of voting, and pulls it all into a more coherent thesis. But the civic voluntarism model is also important because it has remarkable implications for our democratic process. First of all, in theory, we all have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process. That is one of the foundational characteristics of our democracy, is that at least when it comes to your civic life, all people are created equal. But the civic voluntarism model highlights that that's not actually true. Some people have the resources and the opportunity to engage in politics that other people do not have. The civic voluntarism model also very much illustrates the importance of social capital, which includes those civic skills, and of group membership. Because if you are a part of a coherent, organized, identifiable group, like being a member of a church, being a member of a minority community, specifically being a member of a minority community and surrounded by other members of a minority community, you are more likely to have an interest and engagement in politics because of your connections to other people, your sense of a shared fate. You are more likely to be mobilized because you are part of an identifiable group of people who can be mobilized. There are lots of reasons. Your participation in those groups help you build civic skills that you can then transfer to the political world. So being a member of a group, whether that's being a member of a Greek fraternity here on campus, or being a member of the NAACP, or being a member of your community book club, all of those things are going to increase the likelihood that you will have the skills, opportunity, and interest to actually engage in the political process. The civic voluntarism model also highlights the importance of people we call political entrepreneurs. We're going to see this term come up again when we talk about interest groups, but basically these are politicians and other people that mobilize, people who go out, who do that extra bit and bring other people into the political process. Those people are critical to our democracy functioning. We effectively need political leaders, and not just, here we again, we don't just mean politicians, but people who will lead us in the process of democracy, members of our community who will do that for us. And finally, the civic volunteerism model highlights very much the importance of childhood experiences on your ability to participate in the political world as an adult. Your family's interest in politics and your family's identity with a party, those things foster party identification and party identification and interest in politics in you. Your family's participation in church and civic activities becomes your participation in church and civic activities. Your family's emphasis on education affects your own educational attainment, and that affects your ability to participate in politics. So a lot of people get to the age of 20, and if they were not members of civic groups, their parents weren't members of civic groups, they never talked about politics around the dinner table, they don't know what party their parents are, they never went and voted with their parents, their parents did not place a strong emphasis on education or support them in getting higher education, those people are at a disadvantage, and they are probably always going to be at a disadvantage for participating in the political process. Doesn't mean they can't participate in the political process. It just means that they are going to have to invest more of their own time and energy into doing that. Okay, so that's what I have for now. And we will pick up talking about the media, interest groups, and political parties in a couple of weeks.